Every defense system, every battery, every grid runs on one element: carbon. But right now, more than 90% of the world's advanced carbons, the materials that power EVs, protect soldiers, and store energy, come from China. That's a stranglehold with serious implications for the Indo-Pacific's energy and security future. In this episode of Vaxa Intelligence Optimised, I'm joined by Mark Livings, the Managing Director and founder of Sweet Atoms, a company turning agricultural waste into high-performance carbon materials for batteries, defence and industry. We'll explore how waste becomes sovereign supply, why carbon is the next critical mineral, and how Australia can build its own materials sovereignty. If you're ready for today and prepared for tomorrow. This episode is brought to you by Vaxa, the intelligence platform for leaders in defence, energy and critical industries. Our mission? Help you be ready for today and prepared for tomorrow. Subscribe for new episodes each week on Spotify, Apple and YouTube. Mark, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
I'm well, Todd. Thanks for having me. Real pleasure.
Mark, thanks for joining me today. We're here to talk about an amazing company that you've created, Sweet Atoms. You've built iconic consumer brands before, diving into deep tech materials. You know, you've been involved in non-alcoholic beverages and millions of other types of, or maybe not millions, but other very successful organizations. What has sparked the shift for you?
It's a couple of things, Todd. I think, after 25 odd years in the consumer sector, beginning my career with Coca-Cola, small beverage company, you might have heard of it. And then, building a marketing group in Australia, one of Australia's fastest growth companies for many years. It was consistent that we would always be doing business with food, beverage, and other parts of what people use every single day. Of course, we eat and drink, but then what else do we have in our homes? So I was further down the pipeline of use, and more recently, I've moved through my entrepreneurial journey from founder to investor. I started as a venture partner with Australia's Mandalay Ventures, which is an agritech and agri-food investor based here in Brisbane. And I'm also a general partner of a Dutch-based venture fund called 109. So what 109 seeks to invest in is in technologies for good. So I'll give you an example. We invest in companies that we believe can improve 100 million human lives, but also achieve 100 million US in revenue at maturity. So I think my personal journey has been moving from how to sell stuff, then making stuff, and then with those optics as well as the venture work that I've been doing over the last little while, I think it was only natural that I would gravitate to start asking questions around when we process food and beverage, what do we do with the waste? And one of the things that really stuck out to me, and I saw this statistic a number of years ago, food and beverage and agriculture accounts for around 12% of global GDP, but it's responsible for around 25% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So it's a huge contributor to the future of humanity, and anything we can do to mitigate some of those, you know, negative externalities from the industry, I'm really passionate about. And then beyond mitigation is if we can valorize some of those byproducts from that industry, that's a really beautiful thing. So that's why I'm deeply impassioned about this space and really excited about what we're
Wow.
building.
It's interesting, mate. My thoughts just go back to when mankind first, created agriculture, right? When we stopped becoming hunters and gatherers. And whilst it's helped humanity develop, it's also, as you mentioned, causing some issues with outputs into the into the atmosphere. But I guess that's just natural when you've got, we've gone from a couple of 100,000 people on the planet to nearly 8 billion. But anyway, I digress.
That's right. Inherent in that is an opportunity as well. So, I get pretty excited. Humanity tends to pinball its way through progress one way or another. But I think there is a steady state where we can feed the globe without impacting its ecosystem. And this is just one tool in an arsenal of many things that we're going to need. But the fact, just to reiterate the point, the fact that we can create something useful out of something that was otherwise discarded and then would have gone on to enter the atmosphere is
Very
pretty exciting.
exciting, very exciting. So Mark, tell me, was there a particular moment that you saw waste not as a liability, but as a resource?
Yeah, I think my eyes were really opened. I did a stint with the CSIRO in the role of venture explorer, and I know that's a very silly sounding job title. But what we were doing is helping the intellectual property that was developed within CSIRO turn into startups and spin out into standalone companies where they could then prosecute the progress of that technology and bring it to market. So I helped bridge that, and I got line of sight to so many things that CSIRO is working on. And additionally, through my work in venture, and started to see more and more of these waste stream companies coming forward, different ideas, different technologies on how to use it. And I guess that was a penny drop moment where I could combine my food and beverage background with this real move to, make use of these waste streams. And then I got a first-hand view of companies that were doing it. And that was the moment that I really decided that I wanted to be part of it
Right.
as
Right.
well.
I tell you, we had another good friend of the show and a guest recently who had a strong background in CSIRO and especially in taking new products to market. Swaroop Tulsidas.
Yeah.
Oh my God, what an amazing story! When you think about it, the type of people that are coming out of Sorrow, yourself, Swaroop, my cousin's actually one of the leading professors down there in Hobart at CSIRO as well. But some big brains doing some really big things. So maybe that's a bit like the Macquarie is the millionaires factory. Maybe CSIRO is something similar in relation to to technology and food.
There's no shortage of incredible IP coming out of CSIRO and Australian universities. This is a little off topic, Todd, but one of the things that's sort of holding us back is a lack of great
Mm.
founders from in Australia. So, if we can solve for that side of the equation, the technical side, we're good. The commercialization side, we need to work on and bring more individuals forward that can drive these ideas into commercial success. That's really going to benefit Australia. And I think, Sorrow will lean back with a pretty happy smile on its face, knowing that their technologies have actually entered the world and have been making a difference rather than just existing in a
Yeah,
lab.
yeah, exactly right. So, speaking of founders,
Mm.
you and Mark Gostowski, you founded Sweet Atoms. How did you come together?
Yeah, Mark and I, we've known each other for a long time. I started working with Mark when he was the CEO of CEA, the Creative Enterprises Australia, which was a QUT accelerator and venture fund around the creative industries. So I worked with Mark and I did what's called an entrepreneur in residence role. So sharing my experiences, helping young founders find their feet, troubleshooting. I like to say, you're starting to move at speed faster and faster. I help point out the potholes on the journey so you can steer around them. Well, I did that for a number of years, and Mark and I became really close. And he's a he's a terrifyingly intelligent man and a real gentleman, and he's become a very good friend. And we were talking about this space. He had a little exposure to the industry through a project that he was undertaking, and we got to ideating on how we could do it better, what parts of the industry we could attack, and it all sort of began from there, which is just a couple of mates over beers slash coffee, talking about the opportunity, and then finally deciding let's have a crack and let's see
Well, I
what we
tell
can
you what,
do.
I refer to it as Mark Squared. You two are very similar, extremely intelligent, good-looking, lovely young men who are actually making a difference in this world. So, yeah,
Right.
Mark, tell me, I've always wondered why, and I don't think I've ever asked the question, but why the name Sweet Atoms?
Yeah, it's a funny one, right? And look, if you look at every company in the space, they're all really derivative from the science. So it's like Carbonscape, nanotech. And my marketing background is like, no, 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 no. We need something that cuts through here. And we haven't really dived into this yet in this conversation, Todd. But what we're doing is we're working with, as we mentioned earlier, waste streams, but also agricultural products. And we've tested an enormous number of potential candidates as our feedstock for our process. And one of the first candidates we tested was sugarcane bagasse, which, if you're not familiar, is the casing around the cane itself. We produce, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons of that a year in Australia alone. So we started with that and looking at that. And as it was derived from sugar, we decided to call the business Sweet Atoms. So that's the story there.
I love it. I love it. You're listening to the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast. If you're enjoying this episode, please tap follow on Spotify or rate us 5 stars on Apple. It helps us reach more leaders shaping sovereign capability across the Indo-Pacific. Now back to the conversation with Mark Livings from Sweet Atoms. So Mark, you've like you said, we haven't got into the real detail of what Sweet Atoms is doing yet, and we will get there. But maybe one way to describe it for us, if you had to define Sweet Atoms' mission in just one sentence, what is it?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one a lot because it's always necessary when you're pitching your company. Um, but I think I've landed on this, mate, and it's we create the materials the future demands with kindness to the present day.
Gosh, that's almost, is that a sonnet? I'm just wondering that's
Ex-
that's romantic as well. It's lovely.
But a little pizzazz never goes astray, particularly in science-based startups where they're
Well,
pretty
mate,
dry.
you're making science and carbon sexy, if I could say so. And yes, you're a marketing genius, obviously, but so often, as you and I well know, having been involved on both sides of VC, when you're listening to pitches from people who are trying to raise money, no matter what stage they're at, it can often be so bloody boring. It's like, come on. Give-
Yeah, that's typically symptomatic of a technology founder that hasn't found a commercialization
Mm,
founder. And like most things in life, we achieve the best when we work as teams. And you typically need a great commercial co-founder to go alongside your technical
mm,
team. And you can see it when it lacks it. And look, we're a pre-revenue startup here, so we need to sell the
yeah.
dream. We need to capture attention because we're fighting for attention amongst thousands of startups that are all looking for funding or all looking for
Yeah.
customers. So a little sizzle to go along with the steak is often the recipe that you
Well,
need.
Mark, your stake, so to speak, is solving or has the potential to solve a major problem in the world. Right now, the world it's running short on high purity carbon. So
Mhm.
tell me, how critical is that shortfall for things like batteries, defense, and manufacturers in that space?
Yeah, I think might be worth unpacking the uses of carbon. Now, carbon's incredibly abundant. Uh, you and I are both made up of it, Todd, sitting here. It's in the laptop battery that's sitting in front of me here. And it's a critical part of things that we don't see and but often take for granted. So it purifies our water and our sewage, it purifies our air, um, it provides coatings for our vehicles, our marine craft. Um, it certainly is a critical part of batteries, and we'll dive into that a little more deeply. And there's because of its flexibility, as a material, it has, incredible amounts of use cases. You put carbon on the woman you love's finger and ask her to marry you in the form of diamonds, amongst other things. And, we eat it as part of our diet. So it's probably the most ubiquitous and useful element that we have here on planet Earth. Um, but we are, as you say, facing a shortage of high quality carbons in the world. And what's driving that is primarily the transition of the energy economy. So, from traditional petrochemical burning into renewables. Renewables are great, but the one piece of enabling technology they need is energy storage. And so I'll give you an example that most people here in Australia would be very familiar with. We are very rapidly becoming a solar powerhouse. We've got probably other than Saudi Arabia and countries there, the most abundant sunshine in the world. And we can harness that, but it only shines for 10 to 13 hours a day, depending on time of year. So we need a method to store it. And we also need storage to regulate the flow of power so it doesn't overwhelm our grids when we're producing too much. So, this is a really important enabling technology that not only reduces reliance on petrochemicals, but helps us with that transition in a safe and effective way. And then the second part of it is human mobility and portable electrical devices. I think you and I both have an IoT device in the form of a phone in our pockets that go with us everywhere. A lot of that heavy weight in that phone is actually its carbon-based battery. To give you an example, and every person in the developed world has one of those with them, and we see it from unmanned lawnmowers, drones for military use, portable batteries for your caravan. It's a critical component of where humanity is transitioning to. Now, all of this demand has been explosive over the last 20 to 30 years, firstly with the renewables transition and then the portability and human movement. We've had an issue with keeping up with demand for energy storage that powers both of those critical parts of where humanity is heading, and that's what's led to the shortfall at the moment.
Isn't that interesting, mate? Um, I don't know where to start, to be honest with you. It's just mind-blowing, in the fact that we all these things we take for granted, and
Mm.
especially, the society we live in now where it's a here and now society, and, if we can't have it now, well, it's the end of the world almost for a lot of younger peoples especially, but just how important it is to humanity and to society and moving forward. And the
Yeah.
fact though that, mate, as we said, we're running short, on the product, but of note, China controls most of the supply chain and
S
most of the
s
world's stocks of carbons. How do we let that happen?
mm. I think it's natural, Todd, and China's controls a lot of the world's
Mm,
everything at
mm.
the moment. Um, it's a it's a manufacturing fairy tale, and hats off to the Chinese for building an industrial base that the world now uses for practically everything. Um, so we've got one geopolitical power with a lot of capability in a number of areas that are critical for the functioning of a modern society. And how do we let that happen? I think this is a bit of an esoteric, economically philosophical question, but we we saw cheap products, cheaper than we could make domestically, and for the last 30 years, we've been outsourcing our manufacturing base. And look, that's led to cleaner countries in the developed world. It certainly brought China from a second world country when they started this project into a shining example of a first world country from a technology and societal perspective. But most countries of the world now lack the manufacturing capability to ensure that they've got reliable domestic supply chains for what is rapidly becoming as important, and we've been hearing this a lot in the media lately, as rare
Mm.
earths. So high quality carbons are absolutely critical, from components for data centers. Every Tesla that you see driving around on the street has about 120 kilograms of carbon in the base of it as the form of the battery. Having the capability to continue to produce these things, and it's also important to note, Todd, these things have a limited shelf life. So batteries do not last forever. They can go through thousands of cycles, but eventually need to be replaced. If we've become to rely on electrification throughout society and we lack the ability to replace our sources of power and power storage, that can lead to some really concerning economic outcomes. So I think it's incumbent on most developed countries to try and build this sort of capability domestically to mitigate any kind of disruption to that supply chain. And look, the one that we're talking on, and I know we're on a defense podcast here. If there's geopolitical conflict, that's the logical one. But we cannot also consider other things. I mean, it was only 4 or 5 years ago, we saw a boat go sideways in the
Mm,
Suez Canal. Supply chains collapse. Now, if you think about a major grid scale transition that requires its batteries that are then stuck and it's delayed by 6 or 12 months, the economic impacts are massive for that economy. So I think we need to mitigate it not only for geopolitical conflict, but for acts of God or climate change and things like that.
If you're finding value in this conversation, share it with a colleague or friend in your network. Every episode of Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised is designed to help leaders in critical industries connect the dots between technology, policy, and capability. Let's get back to Mark Livings and the future of carbon sovereignty. Yeah, and so Mark, you've touched on some of the geopolitical issues. If there's a chink in the supply chain, but what are some of the security and energy implications for the Indo-Pacific if, not only if the supply chains chinked, but if the dependency tightens as well in what's coming out of China, if that gets slowed down and people need more product, what are some of those implications?
I think energy is inarguably the most critical industrial input in every country right now. And look, we've seen the supply shocks. What happens when oil is limited, and that has knock-on effects throughout global economies. We can point to a couple of examples where that's happened in the course of the last 30 to 40 years. But this renewables transition means consistent, clean sources of energy that power an industrial base, and it removes any risk from global trade or global conflict for all countries if they're able to successfully transition to renewables and then store effectively that renewable power. It reduces any risk of disruption beyond a military strike on critical infrastructure and allows the economy to keep
Mm,
turning. So I think it's a huge mitigant for effective, robust economies, and it moves them from being brittle into being
yeah.
robust in this
Yeah,
area.
that's well said too. One of our guests recently, in last week's episode, or a few weeks ago, I should say, Pete McChrystal, we were talking about data and AI centers, and he used the term, or he coined the term sovereign compute, understanding that,
Yeah.
as a nation, we're possibly heading down this path, given we're only really reliant on one or two things at the moment. But do you think that this is the materials equivalent, given just what you've just said there as well?
Certainly do. I mean, sovereign compute talks about, data center capability in the event that we're cut
Mm.
off from the rest of the world. But there's no sovereign compute without sovereign power. So I think it forms part of an ecosystem of critical production outputs in the form of data processing, in the form of energy, in the form of clean water, and other bits and pieces that come together to form sovereign capability and to ensure that economies are robust and shielded from disruption, whatever the type that it may
Mm.
be.
So, Mark, in your mind, how do you think Sweet Adams, changes the strategic map for Australia and its allies?
It's what we produce is a critical input for all of the industries that I spoke about before. But let's focus on energy for this discussion. Sweet Adams can't solve the
Mm.
problem on its own, but it is part of, as I mentioned before, an ecosystem. So if Sweet Adams starts servicing Australian-based OEMs that are excelling in the energy sector, will be available domestically to supply them what is a critical input from within the country itself without having to import it, to ensure that they can do what they need to do to, provide the foundation for the economy to continue to work. Additionally, Todd, Sweet Adams has the ability to export our products as well. So it's not just a domestic story. Our technology we're really proud of, but we think it has relevance to the rest of the world. So there's a fantastic opportunity here for us to develop a domestic capability. We are certainly abundant in agricultural biomass and food and beverage processing waste. So Australia's really beautifully positioned to become a leader in a different sort of export than the usual big rocks we mine out of the ground and education, which we export. There's an opportunity here to build a very advanced manufacturing base with a material that is in consistent demand and presently in shortage
Mm.
globally.
So, Livo, moving from waste to wealth, how do you
Mm.
turn agri-waste into, graphitic carbon that beats petrochemical materials?
Yeah, it's a proprietary process, but I'll talk about it generally. So what we do, Todd, is we take a waste stream. What we do first is we analyze its biological profile, and what we're looking for within the biomass are certain aspects. So, how much carbon content does it have? How much wax is in there? How many sugars? How much starch? How much protein? And then we look for biomass candidates that give us a really high quality outcome. So once we've identified that, we then put it through a pre-treatment process. So that's a little bit of our secret sauce is preparing the biomass. And then we use a process called pyrolysis. And if you're unfamiliar with that, that is a high temperature, oxygen free burn in an enclosed
Mm,
environment. And look, we've been using pyrolysis as a species since we can remember. The earliest humans used to make charcoal and carry it with them as a fuel source. So we're doing something not particularly different. You'd make charcoal in the middle of the fire where
mm,
oxygen can't get to, but the heat gets really high. So we've modernized that process and we're taking our pre-treated biomass, we're putting it through pyrolysis. We then wash off the impurities, grind it down to where it needs to be, and then move it forward to the next step of the supply
it's
chain.
interesting. That's really interesting. So, mate, how do you manage consistency then from, feedstocks that can change every harvest?
Yeah, it's a good question. The magic there is in the pre-treatment, and then post-production. So managing to extract the pure carbon is the real magic in our process. But look, there will be some variance when working with a variable feedstock like agriculture. Um, but we set a baseline for performance of our carbons, and there may be some circumstances where our carbons outperform our baseline, and that's never a bad thing for industry. So that's how we deal with it and
So,
mitigate it.
mate, this must give you quite a few different ESG and policy advantages, with governments and OEMs, as you mentioned earlier. What would they be, or can you see any?
Oh, certainly. I think the first one is sequestering carbon that would otherwise, go into the atmosphere. By capturing the biomass before it starts to degrade and release those GHGs, we sequester it in the form of a usable material. The second thing is the product itself is critical for, as I mentioned before, the energy transition. So the products that we're making actually assist the world become cleaner, greener, and more productive. And then, of course, our products are an alternative to what is presently and primarily petrochemically derived carbons that are produced in a very toxic manner that require enormous amounts of energy to create. So you may have heard of
Mm.
synthetic graphite. So our superactivated carbon provides an alternative to synthetic graphite as an energy storage medium. So if we can derive these critical materials from green sources, and as we transition our manufacturing process to green manufacturing, so that means the use of renewables, recycling our water, we've got a incredibly, or how I like to say, it's a method where we tread lightly to give the world a critical material that it needs.
Yeah, right. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. Sure, and have you had any conversations with OEMs or any governments around the world? Understanding how this can fit in with their policies.
I think you'll find across the developed world that policies have been formed around this. OEMs, we're in numerous discussions at the moment, not only in Australia but also United States, Europe, and the
Mm,
UK. And there's a great deal of interest in our carbons, not only because
mm.
they're green, because of the performance profile that we're managing to extract as well.
Yeah, and mate, another thing to think about too, I guess, local supply for energy, defence, and other industries that could, use your product. So, could regional carbon facilities anchor that local supply for industry?
Absolutely. And, if this is a bit of a look at our supply chain. Where we want to be producing these carbons is as close as possible to the sources of the organic biomass. So I'll give you an example. We're both sitting in Queensland, I believe, at the moment. So you'd be familiar with the
Hmm.
Mossman Mill.
North
And
Queensland?
North Queensland, there's a very significant number of growers that relied on that mill,
Yep. Sugar.
for their
Sugar.
livelihood, and it's
Mhm.
yep, for sugar, and it's been through its ups and downs, but this is a great example. So we talked about sugarcane bagasse at the beginning as an interesting candidate. So if we can position a facility next to the processing plant for sugar, take off its waste, and then valorize it on the spot, we don't need to move the enormous tonnage of biomass around overland or oversea in order to get access
Mm.
to it. And that creates jobs for the local economy. It improves the profitability profile because we're turning a waste into a profit stream. And and it's also greener if we're avoiding that link in the supply chain where we need to transport it. Equally, we do a lot of food and beverage processing in urban
Mm.
centres, not only in Australia, but around the world. So, as Australians, we have a seemingly insatiable thirst for
Mm.
coffee. If you think about the amount of coffee grinds that are disposed of every day, not only by every cafe, but every coffee roaster that's then making coffee products like extracts or syrups or things like that, that all goes straight into green waste, and then, it leaches, carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. So, if we can capture, uh, something as simple as coffee waste, we have the ability to create processing plants in urban centers as well as rural centers as well. So, the possibilities are pretty much endless, but one of the core tenets of how we would build and scale this is
Mm.
localization near the sources of
And then you
biomass.
look at where most of that is made as well. I mean, this has a real opportunity to activate those regions economically.
Certainly, and it moves them from beyond just producing agriculture. And look, Todd, we're dealing with climate change at the moment, and we may find that parts of our of our country that have traditionally been used for agriculture are no longer suitable at some point. I know you're a great lover of wine, mate. We're seeing that going on around the world where it's getting too hot to grow certain varietals of grapes, so they transition to another type of grape. And then when they can't, grow the Italian and Spanish varietals anymore, what do they do with that land? So there's an opportunity here not only to capture waste streams, but also to capture primary agricultural produce. And we know there's a number of initiatives going on in a number of universities around the world where they're designing specifically agricultural products that have the biological profile that leads to some kind of secondary material. So it's not for human or animal consumption. We're using it as an input to create a
Mm.
material. So I think that that's a really great mitigation for agriculture, and it keeps parts of our country relevant into the
Yeah.
future where we can transition it from a food
Yeah.
crop into an industrial
Mm.
crop.
Yeah. So, there was a fisherman up in Carnarvon, Peter Jex from Abacus Fisheries. He was a blue swimmer crab fisherman, and he years ago, 20 years ago, he started trying to work out ways, what to do with the shells or crabs, if you're picking crab meat, and, there are a few other ways that humans could consume it, because the creatine in the shell is good for humans. So, you put it into a tablet or a powder or something, but he started looking at, well, what else can you do with it? It's pretty hard stuff. Can it go into manufacturing or something? So I'll have to follow up him with that and see how far he got, but,
And we actually took a look at that as a candidate. It's got some really interesting properties. So, and look, this is the sort of work that's going on at the moment, Todd. It may not suit the Sweet Atoms business, but that could be a source of what is biomass that could be valorized into another useful material, moving away from our reliance on
yeah,
petrochemicals.
yeah, it's so important. I mean, I don't know if it's related or not, mate, but there's a lot of younger people under 40 getting cancer these days, and I just can't help but think that, we drink water out of plastic bottles, we heat stuff up in microwaves in plastic containers, the petrochemicals that go into clothes these days compared to 50 years ago. Oh, I don't know. I can't. I don't want to, overplay my hand in understanding how that works, but
Yeah.
I just can't help but think that it's got to have something to do with it.
Well, look, the important thing is, Todd, there's now a lot of very, very clever minds looking at that, and we'll soon have a good understanding of exactly what that
Oh,
impact is.
good. That's it for this episode of the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast. If you found value here, subscribe, rate the show, and share it with someone building the future of critical industry. The path of leadership may be solitary, but the future of leadership is coactive intelligence. Be ready for today, be prepared for tomorrow.